In October 1502, a Portuguese fleet commanded by Vasco da Gama intercepted a large Muslim merchant ship called the Miri off the coast of India. The ship was returning from Mecca, carrying several hundred pilgrims, merchants, and their families. Da Gama's men seized the cargo. Then they locked the passengers below deck, piled wood and straw against the hull, and set it on fire. When people tried to escape through the portholes, Portuguese sailors pushed them back in with their spears. The ship burned for 4 days. Somewhere between 200 and 400 people died. Da Gama watched from his flagship and moved on. The man who ordered that burning is celebrated in Portugal to this day as a national hero. His statue stands in Lisbon. His voyage is taught in schools as one of the great achievements of the Age of Discovery. He was the first European to reach India by sea, opening a trade route that would reshape the global economy and make Portugal briefly one of the richest countries on earth. He received titles, wealth, and the personal gratitude of his king. When he died in India in 1524, his body was eventually shipped home and buried with full honors. The Miri doesn't appear in most versions of his story. Neither do the bombardments of civilian cities, the cutting off of prisoners' hands and ears, the mass executions on the Indian coast. History has a tendency to celebrate the navigator and forget what he navigated toward. This video is about both. Portugal in the 15th century was a small country with a large ambition and a very specific problem. The spice trade from Asia to Europe was the most profitable commercial route in the medieval world. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, these were not cooking ingredients in the modern sense. They were medicines, preservatives, luxury goods that moved from the islands of Southeast Asia and the coasts of India through Arab merchants to the Middle East, then through Venice and Genoa to the rest of Europe, accumulating markup at every step until the price by the time a sack of pepper reached London or Paris was perhaps 50 times what it had cost at the source. The Venetians and the Ottomans sat in the middle of this route and collected the profit from their position. Everyone else paid. Portugal, sitting on the western edge of Europe, with no access to Mediterranean trade and no land route east, paid a great deal and received very little. What Portugal did have was a coastline, a tradition of Atlantic fishing and navigation, and a royal house that had decided, sometime in the early 15th century, that the solution to this problem was to find a different route. Prince Henry the Navigator, who despite his title spent almost no time actually navigating, organized Portuguese maritime exploration from his base at Sagres in southern Portugal for most of the 15th century. He sent expeditions progressively further down the African coast, each one returning with knowledge, with enslaved Africans, with gold, and with slightly more accurate information about what lay further south. The project was expensive, slow, and proceeded in increments so small that it took decades to produce any dramatic result. Henry died in 1460 without seeing his ships reach the equator. The project continued after him. Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving that Africa had a southern end and that the Indian Ocean was reachable from the Atlantic. He wanted to keep going. His crew did not. He turned back, and the moment of completion that he had nearly achieved waited another decade for the man who would actually make it. Vasco da Gama was born around 1460 in Sines, a small Portuguese coastal town, into a minor noble family with maritime connections. His father had apparently been considered for the command of the India voyage before his death, which may explain how Vasco came to be selected. He had military experience, navigational skill, and a reputation for being the kind of man who would not turn back when things became difficult. King Manuel I of Portugal chose him in 1497 to lead the expedition that would complete what Dias had started. The fleet that left Lisbon on July 8, 1497, was small by later standards. 4 ships, around 170 men, enough supplies for 3 years. Da Gama sailed south along the African coast, then made the bold decision to swing far out into the Atlantic, using the circular wind patterns he knew from previous experience to avoid the contrary winds that plagued the African coast. The detour added weeks to the voyage, but put him in position to round the Cape with favorable winds. It was good navigation by any measure. He rounded the Cape in November, worked his way up the East African coast, and arrived in Malindi, in modern Kenya, in April 1498. Here he found something he had not expected: an established, sophisticated maritime world that had been trading between East Africa, Arabia, and India for centuries before any European had heard of the Indian Ocean. Arab and Indian merchants had been sailing these waters on the monsoon winds since before the Roman Empire. The route da Gama was supposedly discovering was already known to several 100,000 people. What he was discovering was that Europeans could use it. He hired an Indian Ocean pilot named Ahmad ibn Majid in Malindi, a man who knew the route to India as well as da Gama knew the Lisbon harbor. With Ibn Majid's guidance, da Gama crossed the Arabian Sea and arrived at Calicut, on India's Malabar coast, on May 20th, 1498. The voyage had taken 10 months. He had found the route. The reception at Calicut was not what da Gama had expected, and the gap between expectation and reality says something important about the Portuguese understanding of where they were going. Da Gama arrived assuming he would be dealing with primitive people unfamiliar with sophisticated trade. He brought gifts appropriate for minor African chieftains: cloth, coral beads, wash basins, and bells. The Zamorin of Calicut, who ruled one of the most important ports in the Indian Ocean trade network, received these gifts with polite confusion. Arab merchants at his court were less polite. They recognized immediately that the Portuguese represented a potential threat to the trade networks they had built over centuries, and they told the Zamorin so. The gifts were an embarrassment. The Zamorin's officials compared them unfavorably to what Arab merchants routinely brought as tribute. Da Gama's insistence that he represented a great king whose friendship was worth having carried more weight than his merchandise, but not enough to produce the commercial treaty he wanted. He spent 3 months in Calicut negotiating inconclusively, was at various points held effectively as a hostage while his ships were prevented from leaving, and eventually departed with a small quantity of spices, some commercial samples, and a very incomplete diplomatic achievement. He also departed with a clear understanding that the Indian Ocean trade was dominated by Muslim merchant networks and that Portugal's entry into that trade would require displacing or destroying those networks rather than joining them. This was not a new insight. The Portuguese had been fighting Muslims in North Africa for decades. The religious dimension, the crusading ideology that framed Muslim merchants not as competitors but as enemies of Christendom, was built into the Portuguese maritime project from its beginning. It shaped what da Gama did on his second voyage in ways that the first voyage had only hinted at. The return journey was catastrophic in ways the later fame of the voyage tends to obscure. Da Gama crossed the Arabian Sea in the wrong season, fighting contrary winds for 3 months instead of the 3 weeks the crossing had taken outbound. Scurvy killed men steadily. By the time the fleet reached East Africa, da Gama had lost so many crew that he had to burn one of his ships because he no longer had enough men to sail it. He arrived back in Lisbon in September 1499 with 2 ships and about half the men he had left with. The achievement was real. The cost was severe. King Manuel received him as a hero anyway, because the achievement was genuinely historic. Da Gama had proved the route was possible. A second fleet under Pedro Alvarez Cabral was dispatched almost immediately, and it was Cabral's voyage that accidentally discovered Brazil when he swung too far west in the Atlantic. The Portuguese were moving fast. They understood that the spice route was the prize, and that whoever controlled it would be rich beyond any previous European experience. Da Gama's second voyage to India in 1502 is where the biography becomes difficult to tell in the heroic mode. He left Lisbon in February 1502 with 25 ships, the largest Portuguese fleet yet sent to the Indian Ocean. The official purpose was to establish Portuguese commercial presence in India, to negotiate trade agreements with local rulers, and to suppress the Arab merchant competition that was interfering with Portuguese commerce. The actual method was systematic violence on a scale that shocked even some contemporary Portuguese observers. The Miri incident happened in late October 1502. The ship was owned by a wealthy merchant from Calicut named Jauhar al-Faqih. It was returning from Mecca, carrying passengers who had completed the Hajj. Some accounts say the ship also carried wealthy merchants with significant capital aboard. Da Gama seized the cargo and the valuables. Was slow to catch. Da Gama had the cannon was slow to catch. Da Gama had the cannon ports nailed shut to prevent escape. He noted that the burning took 4 days. He noted that Da Gama refused appeals for mercy from the passengers and refused to accept ransom. He described women holding up infants through the portholes while the ship burned around them. Correa was not an anti-Portuguese polemicist. He was a Portuguese chronicler, writing in the tradition of celebrating Portuguese achievements. The fact that he recorded this event in detail, apparently without considering it particularly shameful, tells you something about the moral framework within which the second voyage operated. Da Gama's justification, to the extent he offered one, was that the ship's owners were connected to merchants at Calicut who had killed Portuguese traders left behind by Cabral's fleet during a violent incident 2 years earlier. The massacre of Portuguese merchants was real. Whether it justified the burning of pilgrims returning from Mecca is a question that different eras have answered differently. At Calicut itself, Da Gama's approach to negotiation was direct. He bombarded the city for 2 days. He captured a fleet of fishing boats and hanged the fishermen from his masts, then had their hands, ears, and noses cut off, the body parts collected in a boat, and the boat sent ashore with a letter suggesting that the Zamorin used the contents to make a curry. He captured an Arab merchant ship and burned it with its crew aboard. He left the city in a condition that made clear what Portuguese commercial partnerships looked like in practice. This was not aberrant behavior. It was policy. The Estado da India, the Portuguese maritime empire that Da Gama was helping to build, operated on a principle of violence as commercial strategy. Arab merchants who refused to pay for cartazes, the Portuguese issued passes that supposedly protected ships in exchange for payment, had their ships seized or destroyed. Cities that refused Portuguese trading terms were bombarded. Local rulers who allied with Arab merchants against Portuguese interests faced military reprisals. The Indian Ocean, which had been a largely open commercial space for centuries, was being converted into a Portuguese protection racket backed by naval guns. The Portuguese Estado da India that Da Gama's voyages made possible was one of the more unusual colonial enterprises in early modern history. Portugal was a small country of perhaps 1 million people, trying to dominate a trade network spanning the Indian Ocean from East Africa to Southeast Asia, an area containing hundreds of millions of people and multiple sophisticated civilizations with their own military capabilities. The solution was not territorial conquest in the traditional sense. It was control of sea lanes through superior naval firepower. Portuguese carracks and caravels carried heavy artillery in a configuration that Indian Ocean ships of the period were not designed for. Arab and Indian vessels were built for cargo capacity and speed across the monsoon routes. They were not built to absorb cannon fire or to deliver broadsides. In a straight naval engagement, Portuguese ships were dominant in a way that required no particular strategic genius to exploit. The Estado da India used this advantage to interdict the existing trade routes, forcing merchants to use Portuguese-controlled ports and pay Portuguese tolls, while using violence against those who tried to continue trading independently. Afonso de Albuquerque, who became the effective architect of the Estado da India in the decade after Da Gama's second voyage, was a more systematic thinker than Da Gama about what the Portuguese were trying to build. He identified the key choke points of Indian Ocean trade, captured Goa on India's west coast in 1510, which became the Portuguese headquarters in Asia, and took Malacca in 1511, which controlled the passage between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. His strategy was explicitly about controlling the nodes of the trading network rather than conquering the territories around them. The violence that accompanied this strategy was industrial in its consistency, if not always in its scale. Albuquerque's capture of Goa involved the massacre of most of the city's Muslim population, estimated at several thousand people, over 3 days. His capture of Malacca involved similar massacres of Muslim merchants while sparing Hindu and Chinese traders who were considered acceptable commercial partners. The distinction was partly religious, reflecting the crusading ideology embedded in Portuguese expansion, and partly commercial, reflecting a calculation about which existing trading communities could be incorporated into the Portuguese system and which needed to be eliminated. Da Gama returned to India for a third time in 1524, now viceroy rather than fleet commander, arriving to find the Estado de India in various forms of administrative and moral disorder that his predecessors had failed to control. He died in Cochin in December 1524, 3 months after arriving, of what was probably a combination of exhaustion and illness. He was 64 years old and had spent his final months attempting to impose discipline on a colonial enterprise that was already developing the characteristics it would maintain for the century and a half of its peak operation. Profitable, violent, structurally dependent on coercion, and gradually losing its military advantage as Indian Ocean powers learned from Portuguese methods and adapted. The economic consequences of the Portuguese route to India are genuinely complex, and historians continue to argue about their magnitude. The simple version, that Portugal broke the Venetian and Arab monopoly on the spice trade and redirected Asian commerce around the Cape, is mostly true, but misses important complications. Venice did not collapse immediately or completely. The overland routes through the Middle East continued operating for decades after da Gama's voyages because the Cape route was longer, more dangerous, and more expensive in ship losses than the established alternatives. Venice adapted, diversified, and remained a major commercial power well into the 16th century. The shift was real but gradual, measured in decades rather than years. What did shift immediately and dramatically was the balance of power in the Indian Ocean itself. The Arab merchant communities that had dominated Indian Ocean trade for centuries were displaced with a speed that had no precedent. The Swahili city-states of East Africa, which had built sophisticated commercial cultures on Indian Ocean trade, were bombarded and taxed into subordination within a generation. The Spice Islands of Southeast Asia, which had traded freely for centuries, found Portuguese factors and Portuguese guns controlling their export markets. The Muslims of the Malabar coast, who had built the commercial networks that made the trade possible, were systematically targeted for destruction as enemies of both Christendom and Portuguese commercial interests. The demographic consequences in some areas were severe. The population of the Banda Islands, which produced most of the world's nutmeg and were the target of sustained Portuguese and later Dutch commercial coercion, declined catastrophically over the 16th and 17th centuries. The precise numbers are difficult to establish, but the combination of violence, forced labor, and disruption of the agricultural systems that had sustained the islands produced population losses that some historians describe as genocide. The spices that Europeans found so desirable that they sponsored world-altering voyages to obtain them were eventually harvested from landscapes emptied of most of their original inhabitants. The word genocide is contested in the context of early modern colonial violence, partly because the concept is modern, and partly because the intent behind Portuguese and Dutch actions in the Indian Ocean was primarily commercial rather than exterminatory. The Portuguese did not set out to destroy the populations of the Malabar coast or the Swahili cities. They set out to control trade. The destruction of populations was a consequence of the methods used to achieve that control rather than the stated objective. Whether this distinction matters morally is a question that different people answer differently, depending on how much weight they give to intent versus outcome. What is not contestable is the scale of the disruption. The Indian Ocean world that existed before da Gama's first voyage in 1497 was genuinely cosmopolitan, commercially sophisticated, and in many respects more tolerant of religious and cultural diversity than the Europe that was about to descend on it. Arab, Indian, Chinese, Malay, and African merchants operated in the same ports, worshipped in the same cities, competed commercially without requiring that competition to take the form of systematic violence. The Portuguese brought something that world had not previously contained: the combination of heavy naval artillery and religious ideology that made commercial competition into a form of warfare. Vasco da Gama's statue stands on the Lisbon waterfront at the point where the Tagus meets the Atlantic. The monument to the discoveries, built in 1960 to celebrate the 500th anniversary of Henry the Navigator's death, features da Gama prominently among the explorers depicted. He is honored in churches, memorialized in poems, taught in schools. Portugal's national epic, the Lusíads by Luís de Camões, is explicitly about da Gama's voyages and frames them as the highest achievement of the Portuguese people and the fulfillment of a divine mission. All of this is real. The navigation was genuinely extraordinary by any standard. To sail a wooden ship from Lisbon to Calicut and back, twice in an era before accurate longitude measurement, required skill, courage, and the willingness to keep going when turning back would have been the rational choice. The route he proved possible did reshape global commerce in ways whose consequences are still visible in how the modern world is organized. The spice trade, and eventually the broader Asian trade, did shift to the Cape route, and the Atlantic powers did replace the Mediterranean powers as the dominant commercial and eventually military forces in global affairs. But the Miri burned. The fishermen's ears and hands went into a boat headed for Calicut. The Muslim quarters of Goa and Malacca were massacred. The Spice Islands lost most of their people. These things also happened, and they also have consequences whose effects are still visible in the poverty of former colonial territories, in the disruption of commercial cultures that had been sophisticated long before Europeans arrived, in the particular relationship between violence and profit that European expansion established as a model for the centuries that followed. Da Gama did not invent that model. The Portuguese did not invent that model. The combination of commercial interest and religious ideology and military superiority being used to extract wealth from distant peoples is older than Portugal and has been practiced by expanding powers of every culture. What the Portuguese did was apply it to the Indian Ocean with a particular efficiency at a particular historical moment, opening an era in which European commercial and military power would eventually come to dominate most of the world. The route to India that da Gama found was real, and the achievement was real. The world that existed on that route before he arrived was also real. It did not survive contact with what he brought with him. The statue in Lisbon celebrates the finding of the route. The Miri represents what the route was for. History tends to remember the navigators and forget the ships they burned. Both are part of the same story. The only honest way to tell it is to include them both. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video.